A warehouse in Busan, South Korea. Rain coming down so hard it sounded like the roof was being beaten with fists. The kind of rain that makes witnesses go blind and memories go short. Two dock workers who had stayed late found a body slumped near the loading bay door, and when they called the police, they described what they saw the same way people describe things that don't make sense, slowly, carefully, like the words themselves needed to be handled with care. Nigerian passport, Korean gang tattoo on the left wrist, and a burner phone lying 2 feet from the body with one unread message on the screen. The message said, "You were supposed to choose us." Nobody who arrived at that scene understood what that meant. Not the Korean police, not the Interpol agents who showed up 6 hours later, not the Nigerian embassy official who flew in from Seoul with his collar still crooked from rushing out the door. The message sat there like a locked room, and everyone was standing outside it. But in 3 cities, Lagos, Seoul, and Busan, 3 people received the news of what happened in that warehouse at almost the exact same moment. And all 3 of them went very, very still. This is the story of those 3 people, and the 4th, the one who ended up on that floor. This is not really a story about crime. It never was. It is a story about what happens when the world you were born into and the world you chose to build both demand everything from you at the same time, and you have to decide which one you are willing to survive without. Stay with me. I promise you, by the time we get to the end of this, you will not see the world the same way. His name was Dayo, and the first thing you need to know about him is that he grew up being invisible in a country that preferred him that way. He was born in Lagos to a Nigerian father and a Ghanaian mother, and when he was 7 years old, his father got a trade visa to South Korea, packed 2 suitcases, and moved the whole family to Busan. This was 2002. There were not many Africans in Busan in 2002. There were not many places that felt like home. There was school, where the teachers mispronounced his name with the bored confidence of people who have decided that accuracy is optional for certain kinds of children. There was the market where his father worked, where Korean vendors watched him with the particular attention that has nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with suspicion. And there was the street, where a kid named Kweku, also Nigerian, also stranded in this same in-between world, also an orphan who had been quietly folded into Dayo's family without anyone making it official, walked beside him every single day. Kweku had lost his parents in a flooding disaster in Nigeria when he was 6. Dayo's father had brought him along the way you bring a stray who has already decided you are home. They grew up like brothers. They fought like brothers. They protected each other with the fierce, wordless loyalty of 2 people who understand that they are all they have. When Dayo was 16, his father was deported. A Korean landlord had forged documents in a property dispute. The landlord had connections. Dayo's father did not. The case moved through the system the way cases move when one side has power and the other has only the truth, which is to say it moved fast and in one direction. Dayo stood at the airport and watched his father be walked through a gate in handcuffs, both of them crying, his father turning back once and saying the only thing he had time to say, "Learn their rules so they cannot use them against you." He never saw his father again. His mother disappeared into debt. And Dayo, 17 years old in a foreign country with nothing but Kweku and a brain that processed systems like other people breathe, made a decision that would shape the next 12 years of his life. He decided that powerlessness was a condition, not a destiny, and he was going to treat it like a problem to be solved. He got into Yonsei University on a scholarship. He studied finance. He understood, really understood, in the way that only people who have been on the wrong end of systems can understand, how money moves, where it hides, what it can build, and what it can buy. He graduated top of his class and turned down 3 legitimate offers because the summer before graduation a man named Shin Jinwoo had come to find him, and Shin's offer was the kind that made those 3 others look like small rooms. Shin was 52 years old and had been born into nothing and built everything. His father had been a Busan dock worker with a gambling habit and a talent for disappointment. Shin had watched his father lose everything, the house, the dignity, the future, and somewhere around age 13 had decided that the only difference between men who lose and men who win is that the men who win understand which game is actually being played. He started running numbers at 15. By 25, he controlled 2 port warehouses. By 35, he had turned those warehouses into a logistics empire that existed in the shadow space between legal and not, which is where most real money lives. By 40, he was untouchable. Not famous. Untouchable people rarely are, but everyone in Buson's underworld knew his name, and they said it the way you say the name of weather. Not with fear exactly. With the recognition that some forces are simply part of the landscape. When Nigerian traders began flooding Buson's markets in the early 2000s, most of the Korean criminal establishment viewed them with suspicion. Shin viewed them with interest. He had no ideology about it. He was not generous or progressive or enlightened. He was practical. He saw communities with trade networks, supply chains, cash flows, and no protection, and he understood that unprotected people with money are an opportunity. He reached across the divide not with friendship but with propositions. He made himself useful. He learned enough Yoruba to signal respect. He offered cover, connections, and access to port infrastructure. In return, he asked for a piece of every operation that moved through his network. The Africans who worked with him got protection and stability. Shin got richer. Everyone understood the terms. Everyone understood who held the leverage. And then he found Dayo. And for the first time in Shin's life, he met someone he could not fully contain. What Dayo built for Shin over the next 4 years was the most sophisticated cross-continental money laundering architecture East Asia had ever seen. 60% legitimate business. An actual logistics consultancy with real contracts, real employees, real tax filings, that explained the cash flows and gave everything a face. 40% not. Ghost companies in 3 countries. Layered transactions that moved through Hong Kong, Dubai, and Lagos before settling in accounts so clean they practically glowed. The whole thing was a masterwork of financial engineering, and Dayo had built a backdoor into every single layer of it without telling anyone. A kill switch only he could activate. He had never used it. He didn't know if he ever would. But he had built it the same way a man builds an emergency exit, not because he plans to run, but because he cannot sleep in a room with no way out. Shin called Dayo the son he would remake himself for. He said this in a toast at a private dinner in Busan, surrounded by men who ran ports and moved things across borders and understood that loyalty, in their world, was the most expensive currency of all. Dayo smiled at the toast. He filed it, carefully, in the part of his memory where he kept things he was not sure yet whether to trust. The woman who would eventually save Dayo's life, twice, though she kept count, and he pretended not to, was named Sola. She was Korean, 31 years old, and had grown up in Seoul's Itaewon district in her mother's guest house, which meant she had spent her entire childhood surrounded by foreigners and had grown up genuinely fluent in the world in a way that most people only pretend to be. Officially, she was a paralegal at a mid-tier Seoul law firm. Unofficially, she was a fixer, a translator, a woman who knew where every body in the Korean underworld was buried, sometimes literally, and who had built herself into someone indispensable to people on both sides of the law because indispensable people are the hardest to touch. Her older brother had been a cop. A good one, people said, before he went dirty. He had taken money from Shin's organization, not a lot, just enough to keep certain things quiet, and when he had tried to get out, when his conscience had finally said enough, he had died in a staged traffic accident on a Tuesday morning on the way to work. The official investigation lasted 4 months and concluded nothing. Sola had spent the 7 years since then becoming exactly the kind of person who could one day prove what she already knew. Helping Dayo was her long game. She was close to Shin's network because proximity was the only way to gather what she needed. She was loyal to Dayo because Dayo was the one person she had met who seemed to understand, the way she understood, that they were both playing games inside games, and that the only way to win was to see more layers than everyone else. She had a dossier on Shin Jinwoo that could put him away for the rest of his natural life. She had been building it for 4 years. She had not used it because using it would also take Dayo down with it. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself it was strategy. She was not entirely wrong. But she was also not entirely honest with herself about why she kept waiting and what she was waiting for. And then there was Kweku. Kweku, who had grown up beside Dayo like a second shadow. Kweku, who was funny and warm and fiercely loyal, and had been Dayo's brother in every way that mattered since they were 8 years old on a street in Busan that did not want either of them. Kweku, who had watched Dayo go to university and come back different, sharper, more careful, moving through rooms with the quiet authority of a man who has figured out something everyone else is still trying to understand. Kweku, who had never gone to university, who had built his reputation in the streets while Dayo built his in lecture halls, and who had told himself that it did not matter, that they were a team, that Dayo's rise was their rise, and who had been telling himself this for so long that, when it finally stopped feeling true, the lie had already built its own architecture inside him. The Eco Collective found Kweku 6 months before the Busan warehouse. They were a Lagos-based syndicate with ambitions bigger than their infrastructure, which meant they needed something Dayo had built and did not have the ability to take by force. So they went to the next best thing. They went to the man who stood closest to Dayo and had the oldest wound. They told Kweku they wanted to absorb the Lagos network, integrate the Korean operations into their Lagos structure. The deal was simple. Deliver access to Dayo's financial architecture, the backdoor accounts that insiders knew existed but nobody could locate, and in return Kweku would have real leadership, not deputy, not second, not the friend of the genius. Him, his name first, his office, his operation. Kweku told himself he was still deciding. He was not still deciding. He had decided the moment they offered him something that had no Dayo in it. The guilt of that decision and the hunger behind it were living in him at the same time, sharing space the way two opposite things can when a person is complicated enough to hold them both. He started making calls. He passed small pieces of information, nothing that would blow the whole operation, just enough to show good faith, just enough to prove he was serious. One of those pieces of information was about a warehouse in Busan and a runner named Taewo who moved cash through it. He did not intend for Taewo to be set up. That detail came from the Eco Collective's own connection to Korean customs, which Kweku had not known about. By the time the customs seizure happened and Taewo's phone was being examined, and Shin Jinwoo was arranging a meeting to discuss the leak, Kweku had made choices that were already past the point of easy undoing. And Dayo, sitting at his desk in the Gangnam office at midnight, looking at numbers that were beginning to tell a story he did not want to believe, already knew. He did not have proof. He had pattern recognition, which for a man like Dayo was close enough. The question was not whether he knew. The question was what he was going to do about it. And that question, it turned out, was the most dangerous one anyone had asked him in 12 years. The dinner with Shin happened in a private room in Gangnam, the kind of restaurant that takes reservations 2 months in advance and makes you feel, the moment you walk in, that the outside world has been turned down like a volume knob. Shin sat across from Dayo the way he always sat, entirely still, entirely unhurried, a man who had never once in his adult life been in a room where he felt like the lesser power. He said he wanted to find the leak together. He said the word together the way people say words that have stopped meaning what they technically mean. Dayo said of course and smiled and shook his hand and watched, on the walk back to his car, the way Shin's assistant was already on the phone before the door had fully closed behind them. Moving pieces, starting something. Dayo had already found the leak. He had found it 6 hours before the dinner. The trail led to Kweku. Not all the way, not provably, not yet, but far enough that a man with Dayo's mind could see where it ended. He said nothing at the dinner. He said nothing to Sola when she showed up that night with phone records that pushed the trail further toward a conclusion he was not ready to accept. He said nothing to Kweku when Kweku came over with food, and that particular easy warmth of a man performing innocence, so naturally, you had to ask yourself whether it was a performance at all. What Dayo did instead was file it. He had a place in his memory for things like this, a kind of internal archive built from 20 years of accumulating wounds and injustices and moments when the world revealed itself to be less trustworthy than it looked. He had been adding to that archive since he was 7 years old, and a teacher in Busan had decided his name was not worth learning. He put this in there with everything else. And he waited. He waited because losing Kweku was not just losing a partner or an asset or a trusted operator. Losing Kweku was losing the last witness to who he had been before all of this, the boy on the street, the kid in the classroom, the version of himself that existed before the choices that could not be unchosen. Some people, when they are deciding whether to trust the evidence in front of them, are really deciding whether they can survive being right. Dayo was not sure he could. Everything cracked open in Yoido Park on a gray Thursday morning. They were walking, Dayo and Kweku, away from buildings and phones and the ears that were everywhere in their world. Kweku had been nervous for a week in a way. He was trying to hide behind his normal ease, and Dayo had been watching him hide it the way you watch someone shuffle cards when you already know what's at the bottom of the deck. They walked for 10 minutes without saying much, the Han River gray and restless to their left, before Dayo stopped and turned and said the sentence that Kweku had been dreading for longer than he wanted to admit. He did not accuse, he asked. He told Kweku he needed the truth. Right now, no history, no brotherhood, just truth. And Kweku, who was not a cold person, who was not a villain, who loved Dayo with a ferocity that made the betrayal somehow worse rather than better, Kweku told him. Not all of it. Enough. 6 months of conversations with the Eco Collective. Talks about structure, about what comes after, about a future in which Kweku was not a shadow. And Dayo stood there and heard it and felt something in himself go very quiet, the way a city goes quiet before a storm when all the birds have already left. He had known. He had been carrying the knowing for weeks. But knowing and hearing are different things, and hearing it in Kweku's voice, hearing the particular combination of guilt and defiance and desperate need that came out of his oldest friend's mouth on that gray riverside morning, was something he had not been prepared for. He did not explode. He did not threaten. He told Kweku to go back to Seoul, to say nothing, to stay still. He said, "I love you, brother," the way you say something when you are not sure if it is still true or if it is the last time you will say it. And then he stood alone on that path next to the river and stayed very, very still for a long time. Somewhere on the other side of Seoul, Shin Jinwoo was on a phone call, giving someone 30 days. The offer came in Shin's office, exactly the way Dayo knew it would. Shin was elegant about it, the way dangerous men with good taste tend to be elegant about terrible things. He praised what Dayo had built. He used words like extraordinary and irreplaceable, which in this context meant exactly the opposite of what they usually mean. He offered retirement, real retirement, funded retirement, go anywhere, do anything retirement. He said the word advisory with the practiced ease of a man who has said it before, to other people, who then went somewhere and were not heard from again in the same way. Dayo sat across from him and listened to the whole thing and then asked about the workers, about the 90 families in the labor protection network, about the legitimate logistics company that 400 people depended on. He asked what happened to them in the restructure. Shin was honest. This was the most unsettling thing about him. He was honest when honesty cost him nothing and only slightly dishonest when it did. He said the profitable parts would survive. He said the other parts were the cost of sustainability. He said it with the mild regret of a man discussing weather, as if the families who would lose their protection were a variable in an equation rather than people who had built their lives around something Dayo had told them they could trust. Dayo asked for 72 hours. Shin gave them. And Dayo walked out of that office into the Seoul afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, cars passing, ordinary life flowing around him, and understood that he had arrived at the kind of moment a person's entire life has been quietly pointing toward without their knowing. The moment that will define what everything before it was actually for. He spent the first 24 hours alone, not sleeping, not calling anyone, just thinking, the kind of thinking that looks like stillness from the outside and feels like a building coming down from the inside. He did the math, not financial math, the other kind. The kind where every option costs something irreplaceable and the question is not which option is good, but which loss you can actually live with. His own safety and freedom on one side. 90 families, a community network, and the knowledge that everything he had sacrificed and built and paid for with 12 years of dangerous choices would be handed over to make Shin Jinwoo richer, on the other. He kept trying not to add a third thing to the equation. He kept adding it anyway. At 3 in the morning of the second day, he called Kweku. He asked him to lay out the full eco deal, every detail, no versions, no softening. And Kweku, who was by now a man who understood that he had run out of roads that did not lead back to this conversation, told him the absorption plan, the leadership offer. And the part he had been most afraid to say out loud, which was that he had promised the eco collective access to the financial architecture, to Dayo's backdoor system, and that he had made this promise without having it, had made it on the hope that eventually Dayo would trust him enough, or that he would find another way in. He had offered something that was not his to give, had built a deal on the foundation of a relationship he was simultaneously in the process of destroying. Dayo was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then he told Kweku to stay still. He said, "I love you, brother," again, and this time it was not the fearful version. It was the version that had made a decision. What Dayo did in the 68 hours before the 72 were up was the most precise piece of work he had ever done. More precise than any financial architecture, more careful than any laundering channel, because this time the stakes were not money but people, and people do not have the mercy of being abstract. He separated the foundation from the criminal network. Quietly, carefully, through the legitimate legal channels he had spent years building credibility inside. The community fund, the labor protection network, the employment scheme. He carved them out and registered them independently as a nonprofit foundation, moved the legitimate assets in, gave it a board of 3 people he trusted who had no connection to anything that could be touched. He worked through 2 nights without sleeping. He filed the paperwork, he made it clean. And then he put everything else into an envelope. Every account, every transaction, every ghost company, every route, every record of every conversation he had kept in the careful way of a man who always knew this day might come. The entire architecture of the Honolagos network, laid out in plain language with enough detail that any competent prosecutor in any of the 3 relevant jurisdictions could build an airtight case and not lose a single piece of it. He met Sola at a coffee shop. He slid the envelope across the table. He watched her face as she understood what she was holding. She said, "This destroys you." He said, "Probably yes." She said, "You could run, you have the backdoor accounts, you have enough to disappear for the rest of your life." He said he could. And then he told her about his father, about the airport, about the handcuffs and the one thing his father had said with his head turned back at the last possible moment before the gate closed. He told her that his father had not run before they took him. That his father had stayed and worked and been present for every year that mattered and been taken anyway. And that he had spent 12 years building something in this country that was supposed to correct for what was done to his father, and he was not going to let it be swallowed by the same machine wearing a different face. He told her what to do with Kweku. He told her Kweku was not a criminal, not in the way that required what the word usually required. He was a man who had been in pain for a long time and had made the choices that pain makes available. He told her to protect him if she could. She said he was protecting Kweku because he loved him. He said he was being accurate and that there was a difference. They both knew there was not much of a difference. He looked at her before he left, in the way that meant everything that neither of them had ever said out loud, which was a lot, which was possibly too much to ever say now. She looked back. And then he left, and she sat with the envelope and chose. The last meeting with Shin was short. Dayo walked in and said no deal, and Shin looked at him with the face of a man who had already accounted for this and was not surprised, only arriving at the next step of a plan. And then Dayo said something that stopped the plan. He asked Shin if he had ever actually meant it, the sun thing, the toast. He asked if it had ever been real or if it had always been a management technique dressed up in sentiment. And Shin Jinwoo, who had not told the truth about a personal thing in perhaps 30 years, told the truth. He said yes, for a time, before Dayo had become something he could not contain, when Dayo had still been his. He said it with the flat honesty of a man who no longer has any reason to perform. Dayo told him he did not hate him. He said it and meant it, which was the strangest part. He told Shin he had built something real, that some of it had even been good, but that Shin had made the mistake that powerful men always make, which is confusing themselves with the thing they built, believing that if the organization survives, then they survive, when in fact the thing can outlive the man and be better for it. Shin reached for his phone. Dayo was already at the door. He paused with his back still turned and said one more thing. He said he knew the truth about Shin's son, the real story, not the one that had been told publicly. He said he had known for a year. He said he had never used it, not even now, because some things are too painful to weaponize even against an enemy. And then he walked out. Shin sat in his office for a long time after that. The phone was in his hand. He did not make any calls. He looked at the photograph of his son, the young one, the laughing one, and he stayed there until the light through the window changed. The arrests came 3 days later, simultaneous across jurisdictions: Seoul, Busan, Lagos, the kind of coordinated operation that takes months to build and seconds to execute. Shin Jinwoo was taken from his compound in Busan in the early morning. The Eco-Collective's Korean network was dismantled before their leadership had time to understand what had happened. The Hanalagos criminal operation ended in the space of a single morning, the way things that have been a long time coming often end, suddenly, and then all at once. The foundation, the nonprofit that Dayo had carved out and registered and funded in 68 hours of sleepless work, was not touched. It could not be touched. It was clean, it was separate, and it was already operational. It served 400 families across Korea. Its director was a woman from Busan who had spent 10 years trying to build exactly this kind of institution and had never had the resources until now. Kweku cooperated with investigators. His testimony about the Eco-Collective's structure and operations was the piece that allowed prosecutors to build cases that held. He served 18 months. The day he walked out of the facility in Incheon, a car was parked across the street that he recognized. He stood still for a moment, processing. Then he crossed the road. Dayo was leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, wearing a jacket Kweku had last seen him in 4 years ago. He looked older in the way that is not about age, but about the particular weight of having made irreversible choices and carried them through to what they become. They looked at each other across the pavement. Kweku tried to start a sentence 3 times. Dayo let him try. Then Dayo told him he was not a villain in this story, that he was a person who had been in pain for a long time and had made the choices that pain makes available, and that those were different things, and that he had always known the difference even when he had pretended not to. He told Kweku there was a jjajangmyeon place 2 blocks away that had been waiting for them since 2009. Black bean noodles in a restaurant in Busan on a rainy afternoon when they were 12 years old, and the world was enormous and mostly hostile, and somehow that had been enough. Being 12 and hungry and together, somehow that had always been enough. Kweku laughed or cried, or did the thing that happens when you are doing both at once and your face does not have a category for it. And they walked. Sola testified. The case she built with what Dayo had given her, combined with her own 4 years of accumulated evidence, was the most comprehensive financial crime prosecution in the history of Korean African cross-border law enforcement. It took 18 months to work through the courts. It held. She was placed in a protection framework during the trial period, which meant a different apartment and a different phone and the particular loneliness of being temporarily erased for your own safety. On the morning of the verdict, she sat in a coffee shop in Itaewon, the neighborhood where she had grown up, 3 blocks from her mother's old guest house. Her phone had a message on it from a number she had memorized and no longer needed to save. It said, "I hope you chose you." She typed back, "Did you choose you?" He replied, "I chose us. I think that is the same thing." She thought about her brother. She thought about the Tuesday morning and the staged accident and the 4-month investigation that concluded nothing. She thought about 7 years of building herself into someone who could prove what she already knew. She thought about what it costs to carry a thing that long and whether the weight goes away when you finally put it down, or whether you just get used to the shape of your own hands without it. She looked out the window at Itaewon, a city that was always becoming something, a morning that did not know yet what the day would hold. She thought, "I chose us too." Shin Jinwoo was convicted on 43 counts across 3 jurisdictions. He died in custody 6 years into his sentence. A heart attack, the medical report said, which was probably true and was also probably the kind of true that includes the weight of everything a person has done and refused to grieve and carried in their chest for half a century. His criminal assets were seized. The legitimate parts of his logistics empire continued under new management. His legacy was complicated, which is what people say about men who did terrible things and also, genuinely, built things that mattered. The two do not cancel each other out. They just both remain true. Dayo served 2 years under a cooperation agreement and was released at 31. He moved to Accra, Ghana, his mother's country, the one he had never actually lived in, but had been moving toward his whole life without knowing it. He taught finance at a university. He consulted, legally, for development organizations who needed someone who understood how money actually moves through systems that were not built for the people who most need to use them. He had a scar on his left wrist, where a tattoo used to be that he had removed quietly in the second year of everything falling apart, when he had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the right moment to do it. He wrote a letter to his father, the first in 15 years. He did not know if his father was still in Nigeria or still alive or still the man he remembered from the airport, the man turning back at the last moment with wet eyes and one sentence left. He wrote the letter anyway. He said, "I learned their rules. And then I learned that rules are tools, and tools are only as good as the person holding them and the purpose they are held for. I think I finally chose right. I hope you are proud of me. I hope you're still out there to be proud." He never got a reply. He sent another letter the following year, and the year after that, not because he was certain anyone was reading them, because writing them was the act of a person who had decided to keep being the person he wanted to be, even in the absence of confirmation that it mattered. Especially then. Some choices do not give you resolution. They give you something harder and better, the chance to keep showing up as the person you decided to become, day after day, without a guarantee that anyone is watching. The foundation that Dayo built in 68 sleepless hours now serves over 600 families across South Korea. Its current director is a second-generation Nigerian-Korean woman from Busan who was 8 years old when he filed the paperwork. She does not know the full story of how it came to exist. She knows there is a story. She knows it is complicated. She runs the foundation with the particular ferocity of someone who understands that the thing they are holding was given to them, through cost they cannot fully repay, only forward. That is the Afrokorean story. That is what happened in Busan, in Seoul, in Lagos, in a warehouse at 2:47 in the morning when the rain was coming down like fists on the roof. It is not a story about crime. It was never about crime. It was about 2 boys on a street in a city that did not want them, deciding every day to still be there, still be standing, still be something. It was about what happens when the world gives you a wound and you have to choose whether to build something with it or just carry it. It was about the impossible distance between betrayal and love, and how sometimes that distance is so small it fits inside one person, inside one choice, inside one morning when everything that has been a long time coming finally becomes what it was always going to be. It was about a man who could have run, who had the money, the exit, the clean disappearance already architected and waiting, who chose instead to stay in the room and be accountable for what he built, the parts that should survive and the parts that should not. And it was about what that choice cost, and what it made possible, and how those two things live together, the cost and the possibility in the same space for the rest of your life. Some things are worth that. If this story hit you, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments which character you understood the most. Was it Dayo? Was it Kweku? Was it Sola, holding a dossier for 4 years because she could not bear to pull the trigger? Hit the bell. The next story is already written and it is bigger than this one. I will see you there.